look at his beginnings, they're pretty humble. He grew up on the banks of a riverside slum. He's the son of a carpenter, a former furniture seller, and it's because of these humble beginnings that so many Indonesian people who voted him in believe that he can empathize with their problems, that he too has suffered electricity blackouts for hours on end. His house has also been flooded during the annual rainy season. He's also had to deal with the frustrating bureaucracy that can permeate through so many Indonesian people's lives. So it's for all of those reasons that he is very much loved here in Indonesia, and in fact, during his previous incarnations as the mayor of Solo and then the governor of Jakarta, we've seen that he's had a clean, no-nonsense style type of governance, and I think that's the reason why so many people have such high expectations of him. They're really hoping he'll bring a different style of governance to this country.
And he takes over a country that is 90% Muslim, and I know that one of the key issues that he's going to have to deal with is stopping the flow of fighters going to Iraq and Syria to fight alongside ISIS.
Yes, over the last couple of months we have seen a number of Indonesians heading to the Middle East to fight alongside ISIS fighters. That's despite the fact that the previous government actually banned the spreading of ISIS ideology here in Indonesia. Now, it has to be said that the number of people we've been told by the anti-terror chief here that have gone overseas to fight in the ISIS forces is anywhere between 50 to 100. It's not huge, but the reason that Indonesian authorities are concerned, and I'm sure that the new president will also be concerned about this, is because in the past, Indonesia has battled radical elements in this country. Now, I don't know how many people will still remember the Bali bombings of 2002 when more than 200 people were killed in a club in the holiday island of Bali.
Yeah.
But it's those sorts of things that really worry authorities and people here. And I'm sure that the new president will be very keen to stem the number of people, to arrest the number of people from going overseas and joining these ISIS forces.
I know that he's also got to deal with an issue involving fuel subsidies. Tell us about that.
Well, Indonesia spends billions of dollars every single year subsidizing fuel for its citizens. If you were to come out here and fill your car up with petrol, you would be shocked at just how cheap the price of fuel is here. So the government has to wean Indonesians off this addiction to cheap fuel. One of the major reasons for that is because these subsidies, economists say, don't actually end up in the pockets of the poor. They actually end up benefiting the middle classes the most. And so what the government needs to do is to raise fuel prices. Now, this is a politically unpopular move. Every time previous governments have tried to do this, they've been met with huge protests on the streets, and it's something that politicians are very nervous about. Having said that, Mr. Widodo has already indicated that he will have to raise the price of fuel. He enjoys widespread popular support, so it will be a real test of his presidency to see whether he can push this major decision through.
Karishma, just tell us finally about what the scene was like there in Jakarta today with this inauguration. We know that the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and many world leaders were there.
Yes, representatives from 17 different countries attended the inauguration, but it wasn't so much the inauguration that was the highlight of the day, I think. It was the events that followed the inauguration. There was a party on the streets of Jakarta through the main thoroughfare. They closed this huge boulevard where traffic goes up and down on any average day. They closed it off, the authorities, for this massive street party, and that's because the organizers of this event, young volunteers who helped to bring Mr. Widodo to power, said that they wanted to have a people's party for a people's president. And I was out there just a couple of hours ago. It was amazing, like nothing I've ever seen before in my life. I met an elderly grandfather figure who'd come with his 2 young grandsons, and he told me that in the past, Indonesia had seen succession planning through bloodshed, and now they were celebrating with a huge party. That was a reference to the fact that there was a dictatorship here for 30 years in the past, and so a real sense of celebration in the air. Another woman told me that this man is like me. I'm a humble teacher from a village, and I feel that now I have my own president who will actually understand and listen to what I need. So there's a great deal of hope. There are huge expectations from this man, and I think that the biggest challenge for him will be living up to those expectations.
Very exciting day in Jakarta. That's the BBC's Karishma Vaswani, the Indonesia editor for the BBC, joining us from Jakarta. Karishma, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
And I'm looking at a photo on our website of the new president waving to crowds today in Jakarta. It looks very different than you would see in a U.S. presidential inauguration. It's at hereandnow.org if you want to take a look. This is Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from Geico, offering a variety of insurance products, including auto, renters, boat, and motorcycle. More at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
Support for WWNO comes from Bring Your Own, a live storytelling series that takes place in unconventional venues across New Orleans. Each month, storytellers have 7 minutes to respond to a theme. Stories are told live, unscripted, and true to the teller. More at bringyourownstories.com.
For WWNO comes from the New Orleans Botanical Garden at City Park's Thursdays at Twilight Garden concert series at the Pavilion of the Two Sisters, featuring jazz vocalist Christina Perez, October 23rd. Gates open at 5 p.m. Garden.NewOrleansCityPark.com for more.
It's Here and Now. Climbing walls and sports teams aren't the only selling points for colleges and universities. There is the school's carbon footprint. Yes, that's why in the last 6 years, hundreds of schools have signed on to something called the President's Climate Commitment. It's a complicated document, but it basically says that schools recognize the dangers of climate change as a fact. They understand there are benefits to reducing greenhouse gases, and they commit to heading toward the goal of carbon neutrality. Only a few, including Colby College in Maine and Green Mountain College in Vermont, have achieved total neutrality. Others, like the University of Minnesota at Morris, are well on their way. Earlier this year, that school was awarded the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education Gold rating, and Architecture Minnesota magazine praised some of the school's unique renovations, including its use of chilled beams. Jacqueline Johnson is Chancellor of the University of Minnesota Morris. She joins us from the studios of MPR in St. Paul. Chancellor, start with, what are chilled beams?
You would have to start with the hardest question. One of my colleagues describes it as being something like a beer can. So if you have a beer can in the summer and it's in a humid area, it collects moisture, and the moisture helps to cool the environment around you. I think we're the first building in the University of Minnesota system to use chilled beam technology. It's much more frequent in Europe, but it's a way of cooling a building that keeps the people who live in the building much happier than they would be if they had conventional air conditioning.
And I think you're not just the first in the University of Minnesota system, but you're the first entire building on the National Register to use it. We want to talk more about that building. We have pictures posted at hereandnow.org. But just let's back up a second. Remind us, what is carbon neutrality? It's not using any fossil fuels at all. So what is it?
Achieving carbon neutrality would represent the state of affairs in which you are no longer producing bad gas, carbon dioxide, methane, other gases that are not particularly good for the environment. So it, in most cases, does mean using some combination of non-fossil fuels, although schools achieve carbon neutrality in a variety of ways. Some schools, for example, example, work toward that goal by buying carbon credits, so buying credits from organizations or institutions that are not using fossil fuels, and they invest in those organizations and then can claim those credits. That's not what's happening on my campus. We are moving toward carbon neutrality through an integrated system of on-site generation of electricity and heating and cooling using principally non-fossil fuels.
How are you producing energy on campus?
We have a variety of resources. We have two 1.65 megawatt wind turbines. Those are the great big ones. And on average, they produce over 60% of our electricity. We have a biomass gasifier that burns corn cobs, mixed prairie grasses, that burns things from the region. Our gasification system can use a variety. It's kind of a flex fuel system. We can use corn cobs. We can use natural gas if the price of natural gas is lower than what we would pay for the corn cobs. We can also back up with fuel oil if we need to. We're on the Minnesota prairie. It gets really cold where we are. So we've got wind, we've got biomass to heat and cool the campus through a steam engine and a chiller, and then we also have solar panels. We just installed a new array of solar panels that are connected directly to a new residence hall. They will provide about half of the electricity for that new residence hall. So we have a combination of non-fossil fuel approaches to really improving our carbon footprint, but also putting money back into the local economy.
Because you're buying their corn cobs?
Exactly right. It's a 60-mile radius, and so it's really close, and we avoid what would be more costs related to transportation, and that is one of the measures of carbon emissions. It isn't just what you're emitting if you're burning coal, for example, but it's also the transportation costs that are associated with bringing fuel to the place where you're using it.
But shoot, this sounds, I mean, there's the cost of buying the cobs, but I'm thinking you need an entire staff with a whiteboard to track all of this. You know, how much are we emitting now? How do we pull back here and let go there? I mean, is this expensive for you to do?
Well, it's a good point that we need an entire staff, or you need really fancy computers and instrumentation. And so the biomass gasification plant on the Morris campus is installed also as a research and a demonstration platform. And so we have various kinds of instrumentation that allow us not only to measure what we're burning and how much heat it's producing and how we're cooling, but also allows us to measure emissions. There is instrumentation that goes along with it. And so our plant probably added about $1 million in cost in order to install this instrumentation.
That's Jacqueline Johnson, Chancellor of the University of Minnesota, talking about that school's goal of carbon neutrality. You're listening to Here and Now. Chancellor Johnson, you are paying now, but I understand you started thinking about this in the hopes it'll someday save you money.
That's exactly right. So in the early 2000s, when the price of natural gas spiked, the person who was in charge of our facilities said, how are we going to pay our bills? And that was, I think, really the beginning of thinking about how we can use local natural resources to do things that we don't think about doing with local natural resources. Morris, Minnesota is, some people would say it's in the middle of nowhere. I like to say that we're in the middle of everywhere. If you look at wind maps in the United States, we are in a wonderful wind area. It doesn't seem so wonderful in February sometimes when the wind is blowing.
But the sun is out.
The sun is out. That's exactly right. We have wind, we have sun, and so that's solar. And we are surrounded by acres and acres of corn and soybeans. And so we have biomass. And so why not use local natural resources either to make your pricing more predictable in the future, to save money, and also to have a positive impact on the environment. And then, in our case, as part of the land grant institution that is the University of Minnesota, also to find a way to support the region and to find a way to put money back into the region. And that's what we're doing, and also serve, I think, as a model for others to come and see and to learn from us.
Well, and that's happening with a building that you renovated. It's the one that I mentioned that's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's now your Welcome building. I'm reading in Architecture Minnesota that back in the 1970s, the energy crisis, people used to brick up windows to keep out the cold, but you took out the brick and have a more modern glass to take in natural light.
That's right. This is a really beautiful building now, and it was really grim. It reminded me a little bit of a prison. The windows were actually stuccoed over, and so they had little slits that you could look out of, and it made sense, I suppose, at the time. It is now just a spectacularly beautiful building. It's small. It is filled with natural light, the chilled beam technology that we mentioned before. It repurposed old materials and got us to LEED Gold standing, and it was the first building on our campus to be LEED Gold. We have a new residence hall that has just received LEED Gold recognition.
That's Jacqueline Johnson, Chancellor of the University of Minnesota at Morris, a leader in the college movement to become carbon neutral. Chancellor Johnson, thank you.
Robin, thank you very much.
And the Chancellor says students are choosing her school because of its carbon neutrality. It's a big draw. How about your school? What is it doing? Does it matter to you? Let us know. Leave a comment with this story at hereandnow.org. You're listening to Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from Brigham and Women's Hospital, home to 60 years of transplants supporting organ and tissue donation. More at brighamandwomens.org/transplant. Brigham and Women's Hospital, life-giving breakthroughs. And Moo, an online print and design company where customers can make business cards, flyers, and triple-thick looks cards. Learn more at moo.com.
Support for WWNO comes from the Stage Door Canteen, presenting The Mysterious Wisterias, an evening of music and mystery starring local favorite Ricky Graham and an 8-person cast featuring some classic World War II era musical gems. Show dates and ticket information at stagedoorcanteen.org.
Support for WWNO comes from Reginelli's Pizzeria, with 7 locations throughout the metro area, offering an expanded new menu, including classic and contemporary options like garlic knots, a ham, pear, and brie sandwich, and a traditional margarita pizza. More information, including catering and delivery options, at reginellis.com.
A new study shows who's spending what on those political ads that have taken over the airwaves.
Also, is saving money on food a bad idea?
Food is one of the few things that you buy that you actually put in your body. That would be the one that you might want to take a little bit more time carefully considering what it is, where it came from, and what's in it by the time it gets to your mouth.
Chef Mario Batali goes farm to table. Coming up, Here and Now.
I'm Steve Brown with this news update. 120 people are still being monitored for possible infection with Ebola in Texas after having possible contact with any of the 3 people who tested positive for the disease. Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins says in just a few weeks, all of the people who are at risk for Ebola will have passed the incubation period for the disease.
Magic date, November 7th. That was figured out last night, so we are breathing a little easier, but we're still holding our breath a fair amount till November 7th comes.
Officials say 43 of the 48 people on an original watch list have passed the 21-day maximum incubation period for the virus. Secretary of State John Kerry says it is irresponsible not to aid Kurds fighting against the Islamic State in Syria. This comes as the U.S. says it will aid Kurds in Kobani with ammunition and small arms airdrops. Brian Wilson is an American who has joined the Kurdish fighters. He told Sky News that the Kurds need more manpower and heavier weapons.
They're outgunned. They're brave fighters. They just need more help. I mean, if they had, better technology, better weapons, they could finish Daesh on their own. I mean, more airstrikes would be very helpful to help clear out some areas.
Turkey has announced that it will help Iraqi Kurds cross into Syria to help fight the Islamic State. Iraq's top Shiite cleric is throwing his support behind the new government. This comes as Islamic State militants launch a new wave of deadly attacks on the country's Shiite community, killing at least 43 people. Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi took oath of office last month, and he met with the Grand Ayatollah today in the southern city of Najaf. The Vatican is calling on world governments to do more to prevent a, quote, new genocide in northern Iraq and Syria. The Vatican's Secretary of State says beyond a military response, countries must provide humanitarian aid for refugees and address the core causes of the conflict, which he says includes a flow of weapons to the region and instability stemming from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On Wall Street at last check, stock prices are mixed. The Dow's down 15 points at 16,365. NASDAQ is up 42 points at 4,300. You're listening to Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from Lumosity, with a 10-minute fit test to challenge memory, attention, and problem-solving to calculate baseline scores. More at Lumosity.com. And Arizona State University, with more than 70 campus degrees now available 100% online at online.asu.edu.
Support for WWNO comes from Southern Rep Theater, presenting John Bigonet's Broomstick, a wickedly funny play starring Leanne Pattison, October 4th through November 2nd at Ashe Cultural Arts Center. Previews begin October 1st. SouthernRep.com for tickets and more on the 2014-15 season. Support for WWNO comes from the Department of Music at the University of New Orleans, presenting Jazz at the Sandbar, featuring tabla master Badal Roy on October 22nd, 7 p.m. on the UNO Lakefront campus. Maps and information on tickets and performers at nojc.org/sandbar or music.uno.edu.
This is Here and Now from NPR and WBUR. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Many same-sex couples in Arizona are making wedding plans after a federal judge overturned the state's ban on gay marriage. 65 tied the knot on Friday when the restriction was lifted. And for many in conservative Arizona, that was quite a surprise. From Here and Now contributing station KJZZ, Nick Blumberg reports from Phoenix.
The downfall of Arizona's ban on same-sex marriage came pretty fast, at least from a legal perspective, less than a year from the time lawsuits were filed in federal district court. On October 6th, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear cases on same-sex marriage bans in 5 states, effectively allowing those unions to go forward. Just one day later, the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals struck down marriage bans in Idaho and Nevada. Since Arizona is also in the 9th Judicial Circuit, a judge overturned the ban here, and Republican Attorney General Tom Horne decided he wouldn't appeal.
The only purpose that would be served by filing another appeal would be to waste the taxpayers' money. That is not a good conservative principle.
As Horne made his announcement, couples were already standing by at the Maricopa County Courthouse waiting to get their licenses. Nelda Majors and Karen Bailey have been together for almost 57 years and were the lead plaintiffs in one of the lawsuits challenging Arizona's ban. They had decided not to get married in another state that allows it.
This is our home. This is where we live, and we wanted to do it here. So we really wanted Arizona to recognize us and to, make us feel as a whole person too, and they've done it. And we thank Tom Horne very much for making this decision.
Still, Arizona AG Horne did say he thought the judge was wrong to overturn Arizona's ban, which was voter approved by 56% in 2008.
Voters in Arizona today have had their voices silenced by an out-of-control federal judiciary.
That's Kathy Harrod, president of the Center for Arizona Policy, a socially conservative lobbying group. They helped push a bill earlier this year that would have allowed Arizona business owners to deny service to lesbian and gay people based on their religious beliefs.
Throughout this country, marriage litigation is not over. 5 circuit courts of appeals have yet to rule on the issue of the definition of marriage. So in many, many ways, the effort to rebuild a culture of marriage, to continue to promote marriage as only the union of one man and one woman, has just begun.
So which court is likely to rule next? Carl Tobias is a law professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia. He says the 6th Circuit heard oral arguments on bans in Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee back in August.
And I think from the tone and questions in the argument, there's some some likelihood that might be 2-to-1 to uphold a ban. But that's just guessing. And so that could be any day now.
Tobias says if a circuit court upholds a ban, that could push the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the issue. But he's not sure how successful opponents of same-sex marriage would be at the High Court, since it's already tacitly approved gay unions in certain states.
I think that it really is a signal that there are not 5 votes to find a ban constitutional.
After the judge's ruling, a group gathered at a church in Central Phoenix to celebrate that same-sex marriage is now legal in Arizona and in a majority of U.S. states. But LGBT activists don't think their work is done. Jennifer Pizer is senior counsel for Lambda Legal, which worked on the suit against Arizona's ban.
Many people in Arizona don't even realize that same-sex couples here can get married one day and receive a pink slip the next day as a wedding present.
Pizer says fighting for employment and housing protections and anti-bullying measures will keep her and her colleagues busy for a long time to come. For Here and Now, I'm Nick Blumberg in Phoenix.
And KJZZ's Carrie Young and Kathy Ritchie contributed to that report. You're listening to Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink technical computing software. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com.
Support for WWNO comes from great listeners like you and from the city of Vidalia, Louisiana, the gateway to the Atchafalaya Trace in the heart of Concordia Parish, with arts, music, shops, and more along the Vidalia Riverwalk, right across the Mississippi from historic Natchez. More information at cityofvidalia.com. Support for WWNO comes from great listeners like you and from UNO Federal Credit Union, a full-service financial institution serving UNO alumni and their families since 1972.